There are moments when two lives almost recognize each other before they even speak. Not through destiny written in stone, but through something quieter, something human, something real. And if you're hearing this right now, it might be because you've already felt it. That strange pull, that unexplainable awareness when someone enters your life and suddenly your inner world becomes louder. Not because they complete you, but because they reveal you. Two people don't become powerful together by accident. It happens when growth meets growth, when awareness meets awareness, when two unfinished versions of themselves decide to evolve instead of escape. And that's where this story begins. You don't always notice it at first. It starts subtly. A conversation that feels different from the rest. A silence that doesn't feel uncomfortable. A presence that makes you more aware of your own thoughts. And for a moment, life feels like it has shifted into a higher resolution. But here's what most people misunderstand. A powerful connection is not built on intensity alone. It's built on awareness. Because intensity can fade. But awareness changes everything. There are people who enter your life not to complete a story, but to challenge the version of you that has been living on autopilot. And when that happens, something uncomfortable begins to rise. Old habits feel heavier. Old distractions feel emptier. Old versions of love feel too small. You start questioning things you never questioned before. Not because someone told you to, but because something inside you refuses to stay asleep. And maybe that's what this connection really is. Not just attraction, but reflection. You begin to see parts of yourself you ignored for years. Your patterns, your fears, your emotional reactions, your silence in moments where you should have spoken. And the other person, they see it too. Not with judgment, but with recognition. That's what makes it powerful. Not perfection, but awareness shared between two people who are no longer willing to live unconsciously. But here, where things become even more important to understand. Not every connection is meant to be rushed. Not every intense feeling is meant to be acted on immediately. Some connections are meant to slow you down, to teach you patience with yourself, to show you where you still react instead of respond. And if you've been feeling confused, like part of you wants to move closer while another part wants to pull away, that tension is not random. It often appears when growth is happening. Because growth is not comfortable. It disrupts the identity you've built over time. You start asking questions like, why do I feel so seen around this person? Why do I feel like I need to improve, not for them, but for myself? Why do I feel both calm and exposed at the same time? And slowly, something important becomes clear. A powerful couple is not formed by people who never struggle. It is formed by people who are willing to face themselves without running away. But that requires honesty. Honesty about your patterns. Honesty about your emotional triggers. Honesty about whether you are building something real or just escaping loneliness through intensity. Because sometimes, the most transformative connections are not about finding the right person. They are about becoming the right version of yourself. And that version of you does not chase validation. It chooses clarity. It communicates instead of assuming. It reflects instead of reacting. It pauses instead of panicking. And when two people begin to operate from that level of awareness, something changes between them. The connection becomes lighter, more stable, more real. Not because everything is perfect, but because both people are no longer trying to lose themselves inside each other. They are standing beside each other as individuals who are still growing. And that is where true strength begins. You may notice that certain people in your life no longer align with who you are becoming. not because they are bad, but because you are shifting. And this shift can feel isolating at times, like you are between versions of yourself, letting go of what was familiar while not yet fully stepping into what's next. But this space is not empty. It is formative. This is where self-awareness is built. This is where emotional maturity begins to form quietly in the background of your life. This is where you stop repeating cycles and start observing them instead. And if someone is walking through this process with you, if someone is reflecting your growth instead of distracting you from it, then the connection becomes something rare. Not perfect, not guaranteed, but meaningful in a way that demands respect and responsibility. Because real connection does not ask you to lose yourself. It asks you to understand yourself more deeply. And maybe that is the real question you should sit with. Not, are we meant to be together? But who am I becoming when I am with this person? Because the strongest couples are not defined by how they start. They are defined by how they grow. Through misunderstanding, through reflection, through honest communication when it would be easier to stay silent, and through the willingness to keep choosing awareness over ego. So if you are feeling something intense right now, something that is waking you up internally, don't rush to label it. Don't rush to define it. Observe it. Let it reveal what it is here to show you about yourself. Because sometimes a powerful connection is not a destination. It is a mirror, one that helps you see the parts of yourself that are ready to evolve. And whether that connection lasts a season or a lifetime, what matters most is who you become through it. Not who you lose, not who you gain, but who you become. And if you are becoming more aware, more grounded, more honest with yourself, then you are already stepping into something powerful. Not just in love, but in life. And if this message resonated with you, take a moment to reflect. Not on the other person, but on your own growth, on your own awareness, on your own journey. Because that is where real transformation begins. If you feel connected to this kind of message, stay with us here on Return to Awakening. Like this video if it made you reflect. Share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this spoke to you most? And subscribe, not just to follow content, but to stay aligned with the part of you that is waking up and becoming more conscious each day. This is not about chasing something outside of you. It is about remembering what is already within you. And sometimes, what feels like connection is actually the beginning of self-recognition. You don't just see the other person more clearly. You start seeing yourself in a way you avoided before. Your reactions become louder in your own mind. Your emotions become harder to ignore. Even your silence starts to feel meaningful. It's like life is holding up a mirror, not to judge you, but to reveal you. And that can feel overwhelming at times. Because when someone touches something real inside you, something you haven't fully understood yet, you can no longer stay the same version of yourself. You begin to notice small shifts. You think before you speak more often. You reflect after conversations instead of moving on instantly. You start questioning whether your actions come from fear or from clarity. And this is where many people misunderstand the process. They think the intensity means this must be destiny, or the confusion means this must be wrong. But in reality, both intensity and confusion can simply mean you are growing in awareness. Because growth does not arrive in comfort. It arrives in contrast. You begin to contrast who you were with who you are becoming. And the space between those two versions of you is where emotional transformation takes place. In that space, you might feel uncertain. One part of you wants closeness. Another part of you wants independence. One part of you feels open. Another part feels guarded. And instead of choosing extremes, you are being invited into balance. Not attachment, not detachment, but awareness. Awareness of your own emotional state without immediately reacting to it. Because powerful relationships are not built on emotional reactions. They are built on emotional understanding. And understanding takes time. You may notice that when you are around certain people, your inner world becomes more active. Old memories surface. Unhealed emotions become noticeable again. Thoughts you thought you had moved past return quietly. This is not regression. This is exposure. Life is showing you what still needs attention within you. And the presence of another person often becomes the trigger for that awareness. Not because they are causing it, but because they are revealing it. And if you are honest with yourself, you'll realize something important. Not every strong feeling is about the other person. Sometimes it is about the version of you that is waking up inside that connection. The version of you that wants to be more honest, more grounded, more emotionally clear. And this version of you cannot grow in avoidance. It grows in reflection. It grows in moments where you choose to understand instead of escape, where you pause instead of react, where you observe instead of assume. And slowly, your inner world starts to reorganize itself. What once felt chaotic begins to make sense. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel manageable. Not because life becomes easier, but because you become more aware. And awareness changes everything. It changes how you communicate. It changes how you love. It changes how you interpret silence, distance, and closeness. You stop filling gaps with assumptions. You start asking questions instead. You stop reacting to fear-based thoughts and start checking what is actually real. And in this state, even relationships begin to transform. Because now, they are no longer driven by emotional impulse alone. They are guided by clarity. And clarity is rare. Not because people cannot reach it, but because most people never pause long enough to develop it. They chase intensity instead of understanding it. They chase connection instead of building awareness within themselves first. But when two people begin to prioritize awareness, something very different starts to form. Not a fantasy, not a perfect story, but something grounded, something conscious, a connection where both individuals are still evolving, but no longer lost inside their emotions, where they can say what they feel without fear, where they can disagree without disconnecting, where they can grow without needing to control each other. And this is where real depth begins to exist. And in that kind of space, even silence starts to change its meaning. Silence is no longer distance. It becomes reflection. It becomes processing. It becomes the space where understanding slowly catches up with emotion. Because not everything needs immediate explanation. Not everything needs an instant reaction. Some things need time to settle inside the mind before they can be expressed honestly. And when two people understand this, the pressure in the connection starts to dissolve. There is less urgency, less fear of losing each other over misunderstandings, less need to constantly prove something. Instead, there is space. Space to think, space to feel, space to return with clarity instead of confusion. And that space is what allows emotional maturity to grow. But this process is not always smooth. There will still be moments of misunderstanding, moments where ego speaks before awareness, moments where emotions rise faster than understanding can follow. And in those moments, you can either repeat old patterns, or you can pause long enough to see what is actually happening within you. Because every emotional reaction carries information. It tells you where you are sensitive. It shows you what you still fear losing. It reveals where you still attach meaning too quickly. And if you are willing to observe instead of react, those same moments become lessons instead of conflicts. This is where transformation becomes real. Not in theory, not in imagination, but in real-time emotional situations, where you feel triggered but choose awareness, where you feel misunderstood but choose communication instead of assumption, where you feel distance but choose reflection instead of panic. And over time, these small choices begin to reshape your entire inner world. You stop living inside emotional extremes. You start building emotional stability. And with stability comes clarity. You begin to see relationships not as something to hold onto at all costs, but as experiences that help you understand yourself more deeply. And that understanding changes your entire approach to connection. You become less reactive, more present, more intentional with your words, your attention, and your energy. And without forcing anything, your relationships either deepen naturally or fall away naturally. Because what is real does not need pressure to survive. And what is not aligned cannot be sustained by emotion alone. This is why certain connections feel both powerful and fragile at the same time. They are not testing your loyalty to another person. They are revealing your relationship with yourself, how secure you are internally, how honest you are with your emotions, how willing you are to face discomfort without escaping it. And when you begin to face yourself in this way, something subtle starts to shift. You stop chasing certainty from others. You start building clarity within yourself. You no longer depend on external validation to feel stable. You start becoming your own point of grounding. And ironically, this is when your connections become healthier. Because now, you are no longer bringing confusion into every interaction. You are bringing awareness. And awareness changes the tone of everything. Even difficult conversations become easier to navigate. Even emotional distance becomes easier to understand. Even uncertainty becomes less overwhelming. Not because life is perfectly solved, but because you are no longer resisting what you feel. You are observing it, understanding it, and responding from a calmer place within yourself. And in that state, something very important begins to emerge in a connection between two people. Respect, not forced respect, not surface-level politeness, but a deeper respect that comes from understanding each other as evolving individuals, people who are still learning, still growing, still becoming. And when two people can see each other this way, without trying to control the outcome, the connection becomes lighter, clearer, and more grounded. Not because everything is perfect, but because both individuals are no longer trapped in emotional confusion. And when respect begins to grow in that quiet, grounded way, something else also starts to change beneath the surface. The need to constantly figure everything out starts to fade. Because not every phase of connection is meant to be solved immediately. Some phases are meant to be experienced slowly, consciously, without forcing conclusions. And this is where many people rush and lose something meaningful. They try to label what is still unfolding. They try to define what is still evolving. They try to lock certainty into something that is still alive and changing. But real emotional growth does not work under pressure. It unfolds, like layers being revealed over time. And in that unfolding, you start noticing something deeper about yourself. You are no longer as attached to instant answers. You are more comfortable sitting with uncertainty. You are more willing to observe instead of control. And this is not emotional distance. This is emotional maturity. Because maturity is not about feeling less. It is about understanding more before reacting. And when you reach this stage, even your perception of love begins to shift. It is no longer just about intensity, or excitement, or emotional highs and lows. It becomes about alignment, about whether your inner world feels more peaceful or more chaotic in someone's presence, about whether you are growing into a better version of yourself or losing yourself in emotional noise. And sometimes the most powerful realization is this: a meaningful connection will not always feel easy, but it will feel clear. Even in confusion, there is a sense of direction. Even in distance, there is understanding. Even in silence, there is respect. And when that clarity is missing, no amount of intensity can replace it. So you begin to slow down, not out of fear, but out of awareness. You start observing patterns instead of chasing outcomes. You start noticing how you feel after interactions, not just during them. You start paying attention to your inner stability, because your emotional state becomes your compass. And that compass rarely lies. It tells you when you are expanding and when you are draining yourself, when you are evolving and when you are repeating old cycles, when something is helping you grow and when something is pulling you away from yourself. And in this space of awareness, something very subtle but powerful begins to happen between two people who are truly growing. They begin to communicate differently. Less assumption, more honesty, less emotional reaction, more thoughtful expression. Not because everything is perfect, but because both people are becoming more conscious of how they show up. And this changes everything, because communication is no longer about winning or losing an emotional moment. It becomes about understanding what is actually being felt, what is actually being needed, what is actually being unspoken. And this level of communication cannot exist without self-awareness. You cannot give clarity to someone else if you are constantly confused within yourself. So the journey always begins internally, with how you handle your own emotions, how you sit with discomfort, how you respond when you feel misunderstood. And when you start handling those moments differently, your entire experience of connection begins to transform. Even the same situation feels different because you are different. You are no longer reacting from old emotional wounds. You are responding from a more grounded place within yourself. And that groundedness creates stability. Not perfection, but stability. And stability is what allows real depth to form over time. Because depth cannot survive chaos forever. It needs space. It needs honesty. It needs emotional responsibility from both sides. And when both individuals begin to carry that responsibility, even imperfect connections start to feel more meaningful. Not because everything aligns perfectly, but because both people are willing to stay conscious through the process. And in that consciousness, something very subtle begins to replace confusion. Understanding, not immediate understanding, not forced understanding, but a gradual clarity that forms when both people are willing to stay present with what is real instead of what is imagined. Because imagination is often where confusion grows the most. We imagine intentions. We imagine meanings behind silence. We imagine outcomes before they even exist. And in doing so, we create emotional stories that may not reflect reality at all. But awareness gently interrupts that pattern. It brings you back to what is actually happening, not what you fear might be happening. And this shift is powerful in any connection, because it removes unnecessary emotional weight. You stop carrying assumptions. You start asking for clarity. You stop reacting to thoughts that were never confirmed. And slowly, the emotional space between two people becomes cleaner. Less noise, more truth. But this process requires humility. The humility to admit when you don't know something. The humility to pause before reacting. The humility to accept that not every feeling needs to be acted on immediately. And when that humility is present, communication becomes softer, less defensive, less reactive, more open. Even difficult conversations start to feel more constructive instead of destructive, because both people are no longer trying to protect their ego above all else. They are trying to understand each other. And that is a completely different energy. But even then, growth does not remove emotional challenges. It simply changes how you move through them. You still feel things deeply. You still experience moments of doubt or uncertainty. You still face emotional waves that come without warning. But now, instead of being overwhelmed by them, you observe them. You recognize this is a feeling, not a permanent truth. This is a moment, not the entire story. This is emotion, not final reality. And that recognition creates space inside you. Space to breathe mentally. Space to respond instead of react. Space to stay connected to yourself, even when emotions are intense. And this is where emotional strength begins to develop. Not in avoiding feelings, but in understanding them without losing yourself inside them. And when two people in a connection begin to develop this kind of strength, something very rare starts to form between them. A sense of emotional safety, not the absence of conflict, but the presence of understanding during conflict, not the absence of disagreement, but the ability to stay respectful through disagreement. And this kind of safety cannot be forced. It is built slowly, through consistency, through reflection, through repeated moments of choosing awareness over reaction. And over time, it changes how both people experience the connection. There is less fear of misinterpretation, less anxiety around distance or silence, less urgency to constantly define what everything means. Instead, there is patience. The patience to let things unfold naturally, without forcing conclusions too early. Because not everything in life needs to be immediately understood in order to be meaningful. Some experiences are meant to be lived first and understood later. And when you allow that space to exist, something very important happens inside you. You stop trying to control the emotional journey. You start learning from it. And that learning is where transformation quietly deepens. Because every interaction, every reaction, every moment of confusion becomes material for self-awareness. And self-awareness changes everything it touches. And as self-awareness deepens, you begin to notice something you may have overlooked for a long time. You are not only learning about relationships, you are learning about yourself through relationships. Every reaction you have is information. Every emotional spike is a signal. Every moment of withdrawal or closeness is revealing something about your inner world. And when you start seeing it this way, the focus slowly shifts. It is no longer just about, what is this person feeling about me? It becomes, what is this situation showing me about myself? That shift alone changes everything. Because now, you are no longer fully dependent on external behavior to define your internal state. You are learning to observe your own mind in real time. And that is a powerful form of awareness. In this state, you begin to notice patterns that were always there, but previously unnoticed. How quickly you attach meaning to silence. How easily your mind fills in emotional gaps. How certain fears repeat themselves in different forms of connection. And instead of judging yourself for these patterns, you start understanding them. You see where they come from. You see how they were formed. You see how they quietly influence your perception of closeness and distance. And with that understanding, something begins to soften inside you. You are no longer fighting yourself internally. You are observing yourself with more clarity. And when internal conflict reduces, external relationships naturally become calmer too. Because you are no longer projecting as much emotional uncertainty onto the situation. You are more grounded in what is real in front of you, not what is imagined, not what is feared, but what is actually present. And this groundedness creates a very different kind of connection energy, one that is less reactive and more intentional. You begin to respond instead of react. You begin to listen more deeply instead of preparing your response in advance. You begin to allow pauses without immediately filling them with anxiety. And in those pauses, clarity begins to form. Because clarity rarely comes in emotional chaos. It comes in stillness, even if that stillness is uncomfortable at first. But you learn to sit with it. And in doing so, you start realizing something very important. Not every emotional discomfort is a problem to be solved immediately. Some discomfort is simply growth unfolding in real time. And when you stop resisting that process, you begin to evolve in a more stable way. You stop rushing emotional conclusions. You stop demanding instant certainty from yourself or others. You stop treating every fluctuation in feeling as a crisis. Instead, you start observing patterns over time. And patterns tell a much deeper truth than isolated moments ever could. You begin to understand consistency. You begin to understand effort. You begin to understand emotional presence in a more mature way. And this understanding naturally changes how you approach connection. You become less focused on intensity and more focused on alignment. Does this connection bring clarity or confusion over time? Does it encourage growth or emotional instability? Does it allow both people to remain themselves, or does it blur identity? These questions start to matter more than temporary emotional highs. And in that shift, your entire experience of relationships becomes more conscious, more thoughtful, more stable, more self-aware. And as this awareness continues to grow, even your definition of connection begins to evolve, and as your definition of connection begins to evolve, you start realizing something quietly powerful. Not every strong feeling is meant to be followed blindly, and not every calm feeling is meant to be ignored, because emotions alone are not enough to build something stable. They are signals, not instructions. And when you understand that, you stop treating every emotional wave as a command to act. Instead, you begin to interpret it. You ask yourself, what is this feeling pointing toward? Is it pointing toward clarity or toward old emotional patterns? Is it helping me see reality more clearly or pulling me into imagination? And this small shift creates distance between you and impulsive reactions. Not emotional detachment, but emotional intelligence. And that intelligence grows quietly through experience, through moments where you could have reacted but chose not to, through conversations where you could have assumed but chose to ask instead, through silences where you could have panicked but chose to observe instead. And every time you make that choice, you strengthen something within yourself, a deeper sense of stability. And that stability changes how you experience relationships at their core. You are no longer easily pulled into emotional extremes. You are no longer defined by someone's temporary behavior. You are no longer shaped by every shift in attention or silence. Instead, you begin to see the bigger picture over time. And in that bigger picture, you notice something very important. Real connection does not feel chaotic all the time. Even when it is complex, it has a sense of grounding underneath it. There is a difference between emotional intensity and emotional depth. Intensity burns fast. Depth develops slowly. Intensity creates confusion. Depth creates understanding. And when you start recognizing this difference, your perception of relationships becomes much clearer. You stop chasing what feels overwhelming just because it feels strong. You start valuing what feels stable even when it is quiet. And that does not mean you stop feeling deeply. It means you stop confusing emotional instability with emotional significance. And this is a major turning point in awareness. Because at this stage, you begin to realize that growth is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is subtle. It is in the way you pause before responding. It is in the way you reflect after emotional moments instead of repeating them. It is in the way you begin to understand your own patterns without needing external validation. And slowly, your inner world becomes more organized, less reactive, more observant, more centered. And when your inner world becomes more centered, everything around you begins to feel less chaotic too. Not because life changes immediately, but because your perception of it changes. And perception is powerful. It determines how you interpret silence, distance, communication, and emotional presence. It determines whether you spiral into assumptions or return to awareness. And over time, you begin to trust your awareness more than your emotional reactions. Because awareness is consistent, but emotions fluctuate. And this is where emotional maturity quietly solidifies. You no longer need constant reassurance to feel stable. You no longer need every moment to be perfectly clear to feel secure. You no longer depend on immediate answers to feel grounded. Instead, you learn to sit with uncertainty without losing yourself inside it. And that ability alone transforms how you relate to people. Because now, you are not entering connections from a place of emotional dependence, but from a place of self-understanding. And when two people begin to operate from that place, everything changes in the dynamic.